It's loading. Loading. All right. Okay, we are live.
You're, okay, great. So, for the audience that's just seeing this for the first time or following along as it happens, we're talking about teleology tonight. Um, oh, wow. Okay, hang on. All right, there we go. Now my volume is correct. I don't know why it was like that. So we're talking about teleology and the science of logic, which is um, toward the end of the book, really. And um, Hegel takes some pains to talk about teleology as it's normally thought of because it's a difficult it's difficult to picture as something that's internal, an internal process to the notion. And so, at the very beginning, he says, where purpose is discerned and intelligence is assumed as its author. So usually God. And for the end, we therefore demand the notion's own free existence. Um, and he starts talking about teleology um, as contrasted with mechanism. And he spends quite a bit of time talking about how the earlier metaphysics treated these concepts. Usually, uh, let's see, what does he say? It has, for one thing, presupposed a certain conception of the world and labored to show that one or the other concept fitted it, while the opposite one was defective because it failed to explain the conception. And again, while doing this, it does not examine the concept of mechanical cause and effect to see which possesses truth in and for itself. Um, so there's some baggage that comes with teleology, especially today. Kyle, what are some examples?
Um,
Just off the top of your head.
Intelligent design.
Yeah, perfect. That's a big one. Yeah. Um, the concept of a universe designed by a watchmaker and so forth. And with this comes a perception of reality as sort of a mechanical object that's sort of like set moving by an external force, right? But it doesn't actually have the ability to self-actuate its own activity. And so the problems with this are much more than just simply a belief in a divine God, but also a view of the world as sort of an inert object until it's joined to an outside intelligence. So basically, the entirety of reality is a tool that is usable, but it has to have a user. It's I think I think I think some metaphors of computer science and the brain sort of subsume some of this discussion, talking about how the brain is just a big computer. And the problem, of course, with that is that the computer is programmed by an external force. The brain is a self-actuating, self-active object, making processes out of itself in and of itself, as opposed to in another,
Yeah,
which
like
which is programming.
it's just yeah. Also, the hardware itself is crystallized logic, right? It's hardened. It's there. It's supposed to do its thing without. but there's nothing that changes itself.
Yeah. Hi, Julian. He's excited about something.
Hmm.
Great. So yeah, what does he say on the next page? The more the teleological principle was linked with the concept of an extra-mundane intelligence and to that extent was favored by piety, the more it seemed to depart from the true investigation of nature, which investigation aims at cognizing the properties of nature not as extraneous but as immanent determinateness and accepts only such cognition as a valid comprehension. So yeah, the more we focus on God, the less we focus on how reality actually works because we don't see it as a self-actuating reality. We see reality as static, and we come across the objects and they're, for us, pretty immediate, pretty static. You know, we interact with them, but on our level, because we're supposed to be created in the image of God, we can actuate reality ourselves, but reality itself is not self actuating. And then up the spiral to God, God actuates us, right? And to me, this version of reality sounds absurd, but I'm pretty sure it was fairly common among the those of piety, might I say, and probably even today. And so, you know,
Still is.
it it, it it's interesting how it works because um I th I think in general it's a lack of education that allows those of today um who have piety to sort of deal with the contradiction by just saying, well, those are two different questions and we don't have to answer them with in relation to each other. Okay. Um
We still have the creationists and the intelligent design people.
yeah. Yeah,
Plus,
yeah,
plus,
you know, and those are the extreme examples. But I contend even the mainstream religion folks are plenty filled with the positive religion that Hegel says is crap, basically the dogmas. Um, that you know, it's pretty widespread among the more, I'm going to say, uneducated population who haven't.
yeah, it is. But
Yeah,
in the US, good old USA, even among the college educated, still sizable percentage that subscribes to that as well. So,
yeah. Oh, absolutely, they do. I was surrounded by them during college, both times, you know.
yeah,
Of course, at the time, I couldn't exactly have told you um, what I'm thinking about, how I'm thinking about it now. It's just sort of a feeling you have that people deal with the contradiction by not dealing with it. So, there are 3 points to teleology: the subjective end, the means, and the realized end. And these are, I believe, they are. I'm not exactly sure how this works. I read it through, and it mostly makes sense. But okay, so it says the subjective end on page 740. In the centrality of the objective sphere, which is an indifference to determinateness, the subjective notion has first rediscovered and posited the negative point of unity. But in chemism, it has posited the objectivity of the notion determinations, by which it is first posited as concrete objective notion. So he's going through the logical steps here of how things are. Yeah. Um, sorry, I'm having trouble here. Um,
wondering because he does toward at the very end go through the syllogism again to
Yeah.
define all of this and how they all support each other in different viewpoints of the process. It almost seems Lagrangian, and that's the empirical view that I'm referring to. Where you're sitting there, you're looking at one piece of it specifically
Yeah.
that define the whole movements. But I really need to see that.
I wish I could narrate half of this stuff, but even in reading it in front of me, it's force that has not expressed itself is only an abstract inner. That is, it is only in its expression to which it must be solicited that it has a determinate being. So when you're talking about the subjective end, this is sort of an inner purpose that hasn't even connected to a means yet. And he says, similarly with cause and substance, since they have actuality only in the accidents and the effects, their activity is transition, against which they do not maintain themselves in freedom, and may indeed also be defined as force and cause, but these expressions fulfill only an incomplete side. For if they are to be predicated of it as it truly is, they can be predicated only in a way that sublates their notion, as a force that solicits itself to expression, as a cause that is cause of itself, or what effect is immediately cause. When purposiveness is ascribed to an intelligence outside intelligence, as was mentioned above, then in doing so, regard is had to the specific element of the content, but in general, end is to be taken as the rational in its concrete existence. It manifests rationality because it is the concrete notion which holds the objective difference within its absolute unity. So, as he's narrating the logic, he also goes back and reminds you end is supposed to act like this, right? And not like an earlier essential category. Does that make sense? Because the earlier essential category really only has appearance or existence as its I guess it's abstract predicate. You know what I mean? Like if one has a subjective end, right? Um, it's a real concrete thing, but since it hasn't expressed itself yet, uh, it um, yeah, blah blah blah. For end is the notion that has come to itself in objectivity. The determinateness it has given itself in that sphere is that of objective indifference to and externality of its determinateness. Wow. Shit. Okay. So it has the form of a presupposition, and from this side, its finite consists in its being confronted by an objective, mechanical and chemical world to which its activity relates itself as to something already there. Its self-determining activity is thus in its identity immediately external to itself, and as much reflection outwards as reflection into itself. Yeah, so this is the stage where, if there's a subjective end, it's obvious that it has confronted the world. And so it's a presupposition, I guess you could say, in itself. And then you get to the means. And in talking about the end, he talks about the syllogism of the means, where the means is the middle term connecting the yeah. The end, because it is finite, requires a means for its realization. This is on page 743. Okay. A means that is a middle term that at the same time has the shape of an external existence indifferent to the end itself and its realization. So if you have a means to any end, there's usually a tool or a means by which you get to the end, right? You want to go to Vegas, and so you need a means, the car. The car is indifferent to Vegas, but if it is sublated the subjective end, I guess you could say, it can realize it. Um, Something along those lines. But
I mean,
there's also talk about how the means internalizes both of the extremes and so becomes the differentiation of the subjective end to the real end. Something like that.
I guess one could call subjective end a purpose. Purpose
Yeah.
kind of also implies it's
Yeah.
not come to be yet.
Yeah. So you have a thought object aiming somewhere. You have a means that's external um, to that, which might be a thought object, but also might be, a real world object. And then you have an end, the realized end,
That's what it is.
the purpose fulfilled. But the purpose cannot be fulfilled without the means. Um, uh, Consequently, and this is bottom of page 744, this whole middle term is itself the totality of the syllogism, in which the abstract activity and the external means constitute the extremes, and their middle term is constituted by that determinateness of the object by the end, which makes it a means. But further, universality is the relation of the activity of the ends and the means. The means is an object, in itself the totality of the notion. It has no power of resistance against the end, as it has in the first instance against another immediate object. To the end, therefore, which is the posited notion, it is absolutely penetrable and receptive of this communication because it is in itself identical with the end. But now it is also posited as penetrable by the notion, for in its centrality, it is an object striving towards the negative unity. Similarly, in chemism, it is as neutral and also as a different object, no longer self-subsistent. Its lack of self-subsistence consists precisely in its being only in itself the totality of the notion, but the latter is a being for self. Consequently, the object has the character of being powerless against the end and of serving it. The end is the object's subjectivity or soul that has in the object its eternal external side. I'm trying to picture this in my head, like how the syllogism works. And I keep rocketing between what are supposed to be thought objects and objects in the real world. And I mean, I think this is a big problem in reading Hegel, especially this stage, because every single thing he's talking about in the logic, these are all thought objects. And they're all, every step of the way, we can recognize some of the thought objects as perfectly common to our understanding of the world, or even thought objects that are derived from immediate sensible sources. But when we get to the notion, you know, it's sort of packed a thought process in which the different thought objects interact. Does that sound about right, Jim?
Yeah.
You're nodding to me. And that's good because I'm really stretching my brain over this because if I think through how I reason out a course of action, or in this case, I want to do something, right? And I have to find the means. How that's reflected in my head as a set of thought objects is what he's narrating here. And it can be really hard to operate in that mode. I remember Kyle, when we were reading this past week, he talks about how when thought is at home with itself and is able to abstract and move freely in its thought objects, well, most freely, right? Is when it's able to do speculative work with these thought objects. And I mean, teleology in this instance is a perfect example of narrating the process, which is all happening inside your head, right? Of going from I want to do something to I figured out how to get there to actually having had it done and what that thought object looks like. That sort of puts it all together. Okay, I'll shut up for a minute. Kyle, Jim.
Well, I don't know, because I was kind of struggling to this section a little bit until I kind of realized this is ultimately the final unification of subject and object, finally in some fashion.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
I think it really kind of I was having trouble kind of picturing them in relation to each other, even though the subject does develop into the object. But just kind of seeing it's the taking of something external. It's kind of like an external projection, like he actually does call it the illusory show at some
Yes.
point, as eventually, dissipating and becoming for its coming part of the of the object itself.
Yeah.
Well, what was it? I just thought it was funny because it's like the stereotypical thing of Hegel, where he finally says, "Only by keeping this firmly in mind can we grasp the objective return of the notion into itself."
Yes. He's I've noticed he digresses a lot, even in the especially in the logical sections, because if he's in an earlier section where he's like summarizing something, right, and he's almost using plain language, but also the logical language, he gets into the logical section, and as he's narrating, he he has to remind you, oh, by the way, this object is similar to this, but it doesn't act like the earlier one. This notion is supposed to do this. And so he sort of mixes the logic with a summary of previous forms that are similar to it, plus telling you what the end object is supposed to look like sometimes before you get to the end. Like especially in this section, he talks about what the how do you put it? We just said it. Um To the end, therefore, this is on 745. To the end, therefore, which is the posited notion, it is absolutely penetrable and receptive of this. Okay, wait. Shit. That wasn't it. Sorry.
Fine.
Yeah, a little further down it says its lack of self-subsistence consists precisely in its being only in itself the totality of the notion, but the latter is a being for self.
Is that okay?
Okay, well, I mean, so he's not really projecting what the final end is supposed to look like as a being for self. Of course, it's supposed to be a being for self. That's that's the pattern that's been projected. Okay. Realized end. This is the only part I didn't read because I ran out of time. The end in its relation to the means, and this is on the bottom of page 745, is already reflected into itself, but its objective return into itself is not yet posited. The activity of the end through its means is still directed against objectivity as an original presupposition. The nature of this activity is precisely this, to be indifferent to the determinateness. Were the activity again to consist in merely determining the immediate objectivity, the product would again be merely a means, and so on to infinity. So he's talking about the bad infinity that would result, but not the objectivity of the end itself. Therefore, the end, which is active in its means, in determining the immediate object, must not do so as a determinate external to it, and consequently, the object must spontaneously conform to the unity of the notion. In other words, the former external activity of the end, through its means, must determine itself as mediation and sublate its own self. Okay, so he's he's um he's narrating the pattern. The relation of the activity of the end through the means to the external object is in the first instance the second premise of the syllogism, in immediate relation of the middle term to the other extreme. It is immediate because the middle term has an external object in it, and the other extreme is another such object. The means is effective and potent against the latter because its own object is connected with the self-determining activity, while for the other object, the immediate determinateness that it possesses is an indifferent one. So he's narrating the syllogism, right, Kyle?
Right.
Is that about right? Their process in this relation is another other than the mechanical or chemical one. In this objective externality, the previous relationships emerge, but under the dominance of the end. These processes, however, as they themselves showed, spontaneously returned into the end. If therefore in the first instance the relation of the means to the external object it has to work upon is an immediate one, it has already at an earlier stage exhibited itself as a syllogism, the end having proved itself to be their true middle term and unity. So the final syllogism with the teleology has the it has the realized end as the middle term, which unifies means on one extreme and the what's the other one? Crap. The first one, the subjective end, as the other extreme.
Right. That's absolutely syllogism. That's the first syllogism because it's the mediation of two extremes.
Well, I mean, the middle term in any syllogism will mediate the
Well,
two extremes.
when he uses that, usually he's usually starting out. Like that's what I'm trying to say.
Right, right. No, no, exactly. With teleology, you see the three terms shift places in the syllogism. And this final one, I guess, is the complete one. Now, I've noticed that he has numbered it 1, 2, and 3. I don't know why. I feel like I should know why, but I don't.
I think that's actually going through the syllogisms by figure directly.
There we go. So if we turn to this, all right, 748 in the middle of the page, he says, it can therefore be said of the teleological activity that in it, the end is the beginning, the consequent, the ground, the effect, the cause, that it is a becoming of what has become. Wow, that in it only what already exists comes into existence and so forth, which means that in general, all the determinations of relationship belonging to the sphere of reflection or of immediate being have lost their distinctions, and what was enunciated as an other, such as end, consequent, effect, etc., no longer has in the end relation the determination of an other, but on the contrary is posited as identical with the simple notion. So the end is the end, quite immediately, right? So the end is the sublation of what determined it, I guess you could say. But it is it itself immediately. Now, let's see. Examining more closely the product of the teleological activity, we see that it contains the end only externally insofar as it is an absolute presupposition over against the subjective end. That is to say, insofar as we stop short at the point of view that the purpose of the activity through its means is only in a mechanical relationship with the object. Okay, this makes sense. And instead of positing one indifferent determinateness of the latter posits another equally external to it, blah, blah, blah. Jesus. It makes sense when I'm reading it on the page, but being able to paraphrase it, I'm not there. That's what sucks about this. It takes time. A determinateness of this kind, which an object possesses through the end, differs in general from another merely mechanical one by the fact that the former is moment of a unity, so that although the determinateness is indeed external to the object, yet it is not in its own self something merely external. The object that exhibits such a unity is a whole toward which its parts, its own externality, is indifferent. A determinate concrete unity which unites within itself distinct relations and determinatenesses. This is rough.
Yeah, that started to kind of lose it.
Yeah, sorry.
Myself.
So just as in this is 749, just as in this product of the purposive activity, the content of the end and the content of the object are external to each other, so a like relation holds between the determinations of this activity in the other moments of the syllogism. In the unifying middle term between the purposive activity and the object, which is means, and in the subjective end, the other extreme, between the infinite form as totality of the notion and its content. Okay, so he's narrating the syllogism at this point. According to the relation by which the subjective end is united with objectivity, both premises alike, the relation of the object determined as means to the still external object and the relation of the subjective end to the objective object, which is made means, are immediate relations. The syllogism therefore suffers from the defect of the formal syllogism in general, that the relations of which it consists are not themselves conclusions or mediations, but in fact already presuppose the conclusion for whose production they are supposed to serve as means. I read that sentence and I think about how history is written by bourgeois commentators who sort of read the present into the past. Does that make sense?
Anachronistic
What's that?
anachronisms in history analysis.
Yeah, something like that. Since they are thus posited as diverse, it is necessary to interpolate between this objectivity and the subjective ends a means of their relation. But this means is likewise an object already determined by the end, and between that object's objectivity and the teleological determination, a new means must be interpolated, and so on to infinity. Thus, there is posited the infinite progress of mediation. Okay, this is the infinite progress. The same thing takes place in respect of the other premises, the relation of the means to the as yet undetermined object. Since they are absolutely self-subsistent, they can only be united in a third, and so on to infinity. Or conversely, since the premises already presuppose the conclusion being based on these merely immediate premises can only be imperfect. The conclusion or the product of the purposive act is nothing but an object determined by an end external to it. Consequently, it is the same thing as the means. Yeah. Only a means and not a realized end has resulted. or the end has not truly attained an objectivity in it. Okay. All objects, therefore, in which an external end is realized are equally only a means of the end. Whatever is intended to be used for realizing an end and to be taken essentially as means is a means which, in accordance with its destiny, is to be destroyed. But the object that is supposed to contain the realized end and to represent the objectivity of the end is also perishable. It too fulfills its end, not by a tranquil existence in which it preserves itself, but only insofar as it is worn away. For only thus does it conform to the unity of the notion. In that its externality, that is, its objectivity, sublates itself in that unity. Oh, here we go. A house, a clock, may appear as ends in relation to the tools employed for their production, but the stones and beams, or wheels and axles and so forth, which constitutes the actuality of the end, fulfill the end only through the pressure that they suffer, through the chemical processes with air, light, and water to which they are exposed, and that deprive man of them by their friction and so forth. Accordingly, they fulfill their destiny only by being used and worn away, and they correspond to what they are supposed to be only through their negation. Does this sound anything to you guys like Marx's discussion of raw materials in the production process, or the means of production themselves? Even the machines, eventually they wear out. They stop being what they are. They're negated, and they're realized in the end product. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's right here, guys. This is the prototype of production uh, uh, description right here.
Hmm.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Oh my God, I'm excited. I'm excited because um it um you can see that material process reflected into thought most clearly. I mean, it's brought up to like within like 5 feet of the surface. You can look down through the clear water and see it, right? That's freaking awesome. Okay. Mm. Oh, yeah. Um, Hang on just a second.
Mhm.
Kyle,
Okay.
rap about teleology.
Crap. Sure. Let me ask ChatGPT.
Well, in passing, there was Hegel had a discussion of Aristotle's four causes.
Yeah.
In Aristotle's four, I mean, there's four of them. Like, there's the efficient cause, normal cause, material cause,
Final cause. Yeah.
final cause, and even you read Aristotle, the ones that are interest are basically the efficient cause and the final cause.
Yeah, and I
And
reminds me because actually, uh, Arrow Harris actually did kind of talk about that. I mean, it's been a while. Let me just go ahead and reread it so I can remember.
yeah,
Hegel draws attention here to the contrast between efficient and final causation, which,
yeah,
yeah. The first is blind external compulsion, which is nevertheless fortuitous and contingent. Second is not blind because it's determined by to a preconceived end, and its fully developed form is, yeah, it's self-consciously designed. Its
No, honey, it's time for
necessity is self-enforced, and its compulsion self-imposed. Okay. Yeah, I think I just need to re-summarize that. But what was it? Oh, I'm just thinking because his conception of kind of the infinite is where almost seems like oh, I guess say we know the whole has been derived from the simpler before, so the whole is maintained by its implicit purpose in earlier concepts that's developed into the concrete whole, which is itself kind of the opposition of the God that goes out there and just sort of pings the universe into existence. So it's
yeah.
sort of almost like from this that God is itself derived from mankind, not the other way around. Whatever direction you want to take that.
Yeah.
But that does kind of remind me. I think it's well exemplified in like D&D and stuff. It's like the gods that are worshipped are based upon literally derived from the people that worship them.
Yeah.
And one of the examples is a whole bunch of two different factions were fighting. One ended up killing the other faction to make their god more directly their belief specifically.
Yeah.
And so the more violent group got the more violent version of the god.
Oh wow. Uh, that's depressing.
Yes, I think,
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, the whole point at the end is that the calmer one gets recovered by the end of that story. But
Yeah.
let's think about Aristotle. In Aristotle's system, you always have both efficient causes and final causes. That's even true in his physics.
Yeah.
What we would consider to be inanimate objects or processes still have final causes. They don't have purpose. They don't have conscious purposes, but they still have final causes. And that's part. And for Aristotle, that's part of the
Love you.
explanation of physical phenomena. And I think, in a sense, Hegel is going back to Aristotle, but on a more sophisticated basis, maybe. And it also reminded me. I was thinking about David Hume in discussions in his dialogues concerning natural religion.
Yeah.
In most of the discussions there focuses on the argument from design, and in the dialogue, there's one guy who actively defends that argument, and there's another guy who's attacking it. And when after they attack the argument from design, they then speculate on, if you eliminate a divine creator, what can take its place. And one of the suggestions was that the universe, is not a machine, but it might be a living organism. And
Hmm.
that's almost going back. That's almost what Hegel was saying too. Hume was sort of anticipating Hegel, except Hegel fleshes it out in much greater detail than Hume does.
Man, I'm gonna have to read Hume now. Damn.
One way of reading Hume is that that there was actually a lot of Spinoza in him, even though Hume would never admit to that. Was
No one would. Even
Our 18th
even Hegel
century
up to
Spinoza was,
yeah. Yeah, even Hegel to a great extent has to pretend that Spinoza doesn't inform
yeah,
99.9% of what he's spinning out here. Um, which it is.
yeah.
But to get professorship, you have to pretend like it's not, which really sucks.
There's
Really.
also Hegel has discussion of Kant's view of teleology, and the Kantian system, teleology is more of a what should I say? It's it's basically a category. I think he treats it as a category that is a guide to viewing reality, but it's not necessarily inherent in the thing in itself. I mean,
Well, the thing is,
so
it
we
it
don't
it
cannot.
it might be.
Yeah,
It might be, but we being
yeah,
subjective and therefore from the thing in itself can't actually tell
yeah,
is his point.
yeah.
And he basically says, "Yeah, I can't really tie these two together, so I'm not gonna. Uh, I'll give you its general outline, but I'm not really going to say that this is what it is in
I
and
mean,
of itself."
like Kant's discussion of free will says, well, free will is in the noumenon realm. We can't really know whether it's real or not.
Yeah,
Uh, we can posit it, because morality, in Kant's view, morality presupposes free will. But
yeah,
we don't know that. We really don't know if free will exists or not. And that's also it's also how he argued for belief in God as well. We really can't know whether there's a God or not, but morality, for his morality to work, you have to presuppose that there is a God, who makes sure who guarantees justice in the end and all that stuff.
Um,
Which is also how you got immortality in there too. Worked into
yeah.
immortality because in this life, the evil people might seem to be rewarded and good people are punished, which is
Oh
not
yeah.
obviously not just. But morality presupposes that there is a just world, and the only way to make that work is the idea of immortality. The eventually the good do get rewarded, and the evil people get punished. Oh, that's which is why I remember Heinrich Heine's discussion of Kant. He had a lot of fun poking. He poked a lot of fun at all of that in Kant.
Yeah. So, um, let's see, trying to wrap this up. So the final number 3.
I don't know, I guess I could read this thing that I got from Chat GPT as something to try to take away from this. Hegel's theological system is significant because it's not merely a static logical form. It is a dynamic, self-unfolding process that demonstrates how purpose is not an external imposition, but a movement inherently in reality itself. The syllogism reflects Hegel's belief that purpose is not fully realized until it manifests in objective reality, showing that the world itself is rational and purposive. The syllogistic movement's objective end to object in through the mediation of means of Hegel's concept of freedom, and as the purpose achieves independence reality through its integration with the objective world. For Hegel, true teleology thus lies into the self-realization of purpose, which is both freely conceived by the subject and objectively embedded in reality. This teleological system shows how, in Hegel's logic, the world is structured by rational processes that integrate thought and reality in a unity that reflects absolute rationality.
Yep.
I think that's the part I was trying to recall. Like, yeah, this is like, yeah,
And
this is,
and that describes what he's doing, and that describes the result. Though it doesn't really shed a lot of light on the process
yeah.
itself, which I yeah. Um, let's see here, page 753. But this reflection that the end is reached in the means, and that in the fulfilled end, means and mediation are preserved, is the last result of the external end relation, a result in which that relation has sublated itself and which it has exhibited as its truth. The third syllogism that was considered last is distinguished by the fact that it is, in the first place, the subjective purposive activity of the previous syllogisms, but is also the spontaneous sublation of external objectivity and therewith of externality in general, and hence is the totality in its positedness. First, we saw subjectivity, the notions being for self. The notion of end, I think, is what he's saying. I think is what he's saying. Pass over into its in itself objectivity to be followed by the reappearance in the latter of the negativity of the notions being for self. In that negativity, the notion has determined itself in such a manner that its particularity is an external objectivity, or it has determined itself as a simple concrete unity whose externality is its self-determination. The movement of the end has now reached the stage where the moment of externality is not merely posited in the notion, in its differentiation, I think is what he's saying, but as a concrete totality is identical with the immediate objectivity. This identity is on the one hand the simple notion and the equally immediate objectivity, but on the other hand, it is just as essentially a mediation, and only through the latter as a self-sublating mediation is it that simple immediacy. The notion is therefore essentially this, and this is the result: to be distinct as an explicit identity from its implicit objectivity, and therefore to possess externality, yet in this external totality, to be the totality's self-determining identity. As such, the notion is now the idea. That's the one thing about his narration, is that when he talks about the notion, so first we saw subjectivity, the notions being for self. So you have the subjective end, but the way that it's narrated, when he says the notions being for self, he means ends being for self. Like, he's not reasserting the notion as was the result of the end of substance, right? He's talking about end. But the way that it's written here is confusing. So first we saw subjectivity. The ends being for self pass over into its in itself objectivity in the means, basically, to be followed by the reappearance in the latter of the negativity of the notions being for self. In that negativity, the end has determined itself in such a manner that its particularity is an external objectivity, or it has determined itself as a simple concrete unity whose externality is its self-determination. So it's a complete notion. The end is a complete notion, having sublated the subjective subjective idea, right? According to Verstand, along with the external means with which to fulfill it as a, half-baked idea. And then, yeah. And so the in itself of the end, is fulfilled this way. And so, like, if you think of it like a proposition, right? The speculative proposition that he talks about earlier, the result as the realized end will contain both the objectivity of the means as well as the subjectivity of the immediate purpose, right? And so the result, in reality, even if it's just in your head, and all of these objects are just in your head, really, until they're made real through action, I guess you could say, right? It's still a thought object. And that thought object, which is the result, is the idea. It's the purpose, subjective purpose married to the objective means. And the result is the idea. So idea contains purpose as well as idea contains purpose as well as means.
I did think it was funny pictorially, because you know how many times we talk about like the notion, like early forms of notion, overgrasps its other and it eventually takes over. This is the first case where it's actually an intentional overgrasping.
Overgrasping, yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting this first time it's like directly intentional too. As a pictorial, I think it's like we finally hit an action state or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what does he say here? The idea is the adequate notion that which is objectively true, or the truth as such. When anything whatever possesses truth, it possesses it through its idea, or something possesses truth only insofar as it is idea. And then he goes into a long discussion on what idea is. And I'm sure he's going to talk about the idea in its immediacy, which is life. Back. Yeah, at this first stage, the idea is life, the notion that distinguished from its objectivity simply within itself pervades its objectivity and as its own end possesses its means in the objectivity and posits the latter as its means. Yet, wow, wow, yet is immanent in this means and is therein the realized end as identical with itself. This idea, on account of its immediacy, has individuality for the form of its existence. But this reflection into self of its absolute process is the sublating of this immediate individuality. Therefore, the notion, which as universality in this individuality is the inwardness of the latter, converts the externality into universality or posits its objectivity as being the same as itself. In this second stage, the idea is the idea of the true and the good as cognition and volition. So there's life and then there's cognition, and then spirit cognizes the idea as its absolute truth at the end, as the truth that is in and for itself, the infinite idea in which cognition and action are equalized, and which is the absolute knowledge of itself. So the absolute idea is the how would he put it? Is it the absolute idea? Yeah, chapter 3, the absolute idea. The absolute idea is um, the realization that theory and practice, sort of the thinking as well as action, are put on an equal basis, right? And given this, I, I, I would suggest that Marx's idea that one can go from this to a materialist analysis is only really possible once one realizes that cognition and action um, being equalized can, you know, um, one can be the transmission belt of the other. Like, how can you change the world? You've got to cognize it, right? The whatever it is, the thesis of Feuerbach. Philosophers have tried to understand the world. The point is to change it, and it's really only through Hegel, from what I'm reading here, that one can adequately um, take an action that's well, it's not the same thing. You know, it's like eating. You know, we all think whether or not we come to a clarified um, idea of thinking, of clarified cognition, you know, through reading this, right? But in order to think about political economy, Marx had to um, show its totality in order to describe it so that action could be possible, so that change, um, so that it would be obvious what needed to be changed and along what axis. Does that make sense? So, so for Marx, it's not enough to read this and say, okay, let's go change capitalism, which he's right about. But this does provide the blueprint for making such an effort, which is why he wrote Capital. And Capital being organized in exactly the same way, roughly, one is able to see how to change the world in the present circumstances. Or in Hegel's case, how to judge art according to whether it's true to its purpose, I guess you could say. and what it is, or what religion is supposed to impart, modern religion, its philosophical forms that emerged with the Lutheran movement, I guess you could say. Um, or how to realize what law in the state consists of, um, which is the philosophy of right. So yeah, that was actually kind of awesome. This is we're coming right up to it. Um, I feel like I haven't really um totally internalized every step of the way so far. Um, you know what I mean? Like for weeks here we've been talking about the syllogism, the judgment, and we've sort of been stumbling over the rocks. But it's only been in the last couple classes with Kyle and Alex where I've reread the Encyclopedia Logic that I've really started to understand that contained in that what is it called? That first preliminary conception right after the introduction. He teaches you how to read the science of logic, and he tells you what he's doing in general. But the first time you read it through, you have no idea what he's talking about, you know. Um, anyway, it's really kind of cool. Um, so for next time, we could read section 3, the how long is this going to be? Why don't we read from page 755 until 774? So, section 3, the idea, it's got a few pages which summarize what the idea is supposed to be. And then he goes into life, which is the immediate notion of the idea.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest. Was going to suggest as well. So,
Yeah. Because, and
hmm.
then the next time we can talk about just the idea of cognition, because that's quite a march through what cognition is supposed to consist of. And then from there, how long is the absolute idea? It's from 824 until 844. So we've got 1, 2, 3 sessions until we're done with the book. And then we can talk about our next steps. But yeah, so just to summarize, next time we'll talk about section 3, the idea, and the first section called life. Sound good? All right, comrades. We only went 15 over, but that's all right because
Late.
was that?
We started late anyway, so.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, cool. Well, you all have a very nice night, and we'll see you next week.